Hey folks, George here. Today we're going to continue our discussion about ethics and war. Last time we talked about Douglas Lackey's article on pacifism. Today we're going to visit and examine Jan Narveson's article, Pacifism, a Philosophical Analysis. Now, Jan Narveson is certainly going to illustrate or try to argue for, I don't know how to put this kindly, the absurdity of pacifism, yes? How does he start? He starts by reminding us that nobody thinks that violence is a good thing, especially not violence against innocent people. Nobody thinks that. With that out of the way, then the only kind of pacifism that's meaningful or interesting would have to say that it's immoral to use violence to stop violence. That is, it's immoral to use violence even for self-defense. Okay, Jan Narveson is going to spoil it for us right here at the beginning and say this is self-contradictory. This is clearly a self-contradictory position. Let's see how Narveson's arguments and reasons for his arguments illustrate the self-contradictory nature of pacifism. Narveson asks, just how far is a pacifist willing to go? Who ought to use force in order to resist violence, and who ought not to use force or violence in order to stop further violence? By the way, Narveson wants to remind us, non-pacifists do not say that we have to use violence, that we're obligated to use violence. They don't say that. Rather, a non-pacifist like Narveson is merely going to say, you are permitted to use violence to stop further violence. To really make Narveson's point clear, a pacifist must say that there's something morally wrong about using force to resist violence. A pacifist must say that. Because, by the way, if they don't say that, then guess what? They're not saying anything interesting. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by saying they're not saying anything interesting? Unless they're saying it's wrong to use force. Because everybody agrees that self-defense, using force for self-defense, is acceptable. That's not an interesting claim. That's not an interesting claim at all. Everybody would agree to that. Therefore, to say something really interesting, a pacifist has to go all the way and say there's something morally wrong with self-defense. Right? Otherwise, what is pacifism trying to say? Well, something that we all agree with. Something non-controversial. But the only interesting kind of pacifism is the kind of pacifism that would say that something like self-defense, even using force for self-defense, is impermissible, is wrong. Now, like Lackey, Narveson recognizes the universal nature of morality. That is, a subjective pacifist is almost meaningless, right? What does that mean? It would mean that, oh, I believe I should be a pacifist, but not anybody else. Merely believing that I have a duty to pacifism doesn't necessarily mean that there really is a duty to pacifism, right? It must be universal. It must be universal. Otherwise, it's not a moral principle. And it's, again, merely a taste. Narveson reminds us of this quote by Jeremy Bentham that suggests something like, if you preach some kind of subjectivist morality, really you're just preaching the negation of all principles altogether. So what is this definition of pacifism that Narveson is going to try to argue against? Pacifism is the moral principle that using force to stop force is wrong. Using self-defense to stop somebody hurting me is wrong, somehow, according to pacifism. That's the kind of pacifism that Narveson is going to argue against. What else does this kind of pacifism entail? Well, I've already said, this kind of pacifism entails that self-defense is wrong. What else does it entail? It also entails that punishing criminals is wrong. Again, pacifism, by Narveson's definition, is the claim that using force to fight force is morally wrong. Otherwise, what kind of pacifism is this? It wouldn't be an interesting kind of pacifism at all, right? Narveson takes a step back and says, wait a second, what is the point, after all, of pacifism anyway? Well, the point is, presumably, the opposition to violence. Pacifists oppose violence. Wait a second, Narveson says, if you're not willing to do anything to oppose violence, then you're a hypocrite. Then you don't actually oppose violence. You're just speaking, but not willing to act and follow through with what your words are saying. I oppose violence. Well, what does that mean if you're not actually going to do something about violence when it happens? Now, I guess I'm going to try to be a little bit charitable to the pacifists here and suggest, wouldn't a pacifist say something like, well, I will protest against violence? Okay, Narveson would say, and is that what we should have done in World War II against Adolf Hitler and the Nazis? Merely protest and say, you are a bad person. Well, it seems to me, it's been a while since I've read a World War II history book, but it seems to me that many people did speak out against Adolf Hitler and the Nazi force, and they didn't care, right? They didn't care. That's Narveson's point. That's Narveson's point, I think. So Narveson tries to spell this out very carefully. Step one, when violence is done to someone. Let's call that person a victim. The victim is having her rights violated when violence is done upon her. A victim's rights are violated when unjustified violence is done upon her. Narveson asks this question: what does a right mean if it doesn't mean that you have the right to defend that right? For Narveson, that notion is completely absurd. The very notion of right entails I have a right to do something when my rights are violated. Otherwise, what does a right to life really mean? Narveson asks. The very notion of a right entails using violence to defend that right. Narveson recalls perhaps one of Lackey's responses, wherein Lackey would say, yeah, but there's always an alternative, right? We can start to engage with rational discourse, Lackey or a pacifist might claim. Narveson is going to say, wait a second, what are you talking about? You can't be rational with somebody who's obviously doing something irrational. That is, committing unjustified violence. They're too busy being violent to be rational, to be reasonable. How can I have a reasonable discussion with somebody who's already proven that they're not reasonable by their excessive use of violence? By the way, if the perpetrator, if the violent actor were reasonable, one thing that any reasonable person would agree to is that self-defense is a reasonable response to unjustified violence. Any reasonable person would agree to that. And so to really bring this point home, Narveson reminds us what he said already, what I've said already. If we have a right to anything at all, then we have a right to use force to protect those rights. That's the very meaning of a right. This makes us conclude that the pacifist position is self-contradictory, right? In saying that violence is wrong, anybody who says violence is wrong, well, then you have to acknowledge that violence must be used, force must be used to stop wrongdoing. That's the very meaning of right and wrong, presumably, according to Narveson. See you next time. Bye-bye.